wind carried the smell of dry grass and horse sweat across the Wyoming plains, the evening Daniel Cole rode up to the Coleman Ranch, not knowing his whole life was about to bend in a new direction. He'd come for a simple reason. Martha Coleman, the widow who ran the place alone since her husband passed 2 winters back, had sent word that her fence line was down again. Nothing unusual. He'd fixed that same fence 3 times already that year. But this time, when he stepped onto the porch and knocked the dust off his boots, Martha didn't answer the door herself. Her daughter did. Abigail Coleman stood in the doorway with flour on her apron and a strand of dark hair loose against her cheek. The porch went still. Even the crickets in the yard seemed to hold their breath. Behind her, hidden just past the kitchen curtain, Martha watched with her arms crossed and a small, satisfied smile creeping onto her face. She leaned toward the stove and murmured to herself, so quiet only the walls could hear it. "My daughter needs a husband," the widow whispered, "and I believe the Lord just rode him up to my front porch." She had no idea how right or how complicated that thought would turn out to be. Because what came next wasn't just a fence to mend. It was a friendship that would test patience, pride, and the quiet ache of 2 people too stubborn to admit what was growing between them. If you want to know how a broken fence turned into the love story an entire town would talk about for years, stay with me. This is a gentle one, friends. No shouting, no villains lurking in the shadows. Just a slow, western sunset kind of love. The kind you didn't know you needed until it's warming your chest. Daniel Cole was 26 years old, built from years of ranch work, broad shoulders, sun-browned hands, and the kind of quiet manner that made people trust him before he even said a word. He lived on the neighboring spread with his aging father, and ever since old Thomas Coleman had died, Daniel had made it a habit to check in on the widow and her daughter whenever he rode past. That evening, he found the west fence down again, the same stretch of split-rail fencing that had been giving trouble all year. Out here, most ranchers built what folks called a post and rail fence. Thick cedar posts sunk deep into the ground, with long horizontal rails notched between them. No nails required if it was done right. It was sturdy work when the wood was good, but cedar posts left too long in wet spring ground would soften at the base, and once that happened, no amount of patching held for long. That was exactly what Daniel found kneeling in the dirt that evening. 3 posts gone soft, clean through. "You're going to need new posts, Mrs. Coleman," he said, running his thumb along the rotted wood. "Not patches. The whole line's tired, and with the ground this wet after spring thaw, it'll keep giving out until we replace it proper." Martha stood at the edge of the yard, wiping her hands on her apron, watching him work more than she watched the fence. "Well, I suppose you'll have to come back and do it properly then," she said, far too casually. "Perhaps Sunday? Abigail's making her stew. You remember how much you liked it last spring?" Daniel did remember. He remembered it more than he probably should have. "I don't want to be any trouble," he said. "Nonsense," Martha said, already walking back toward the house. "It's no trouble having good company at the table." From the barn, Abigail had heard every word, and she rolled her eyes at her mother's not-so-subtle scheming. But when she peeked through the barn door and saw Daniel standing there in the fading light, hat in hand, looking unsure of himself for the first time she could remember, something in her chest did a small, unexpected flip. She told herself it was nothing, just neighborly warmth, nothing more. She was wrong, of course, but she wouldn't realize that for a while yet. Sunday came, and Daniel arrived freshly washed, his good shirt pressed, his hair combed down in a way that made Martha smile the moment she opened the door. "You didn't need to dress up for a bit of stew," she teased. "Didn't want to smell like the barn at your table," Daniel said, and Martha laughed, a full, warm laugh that hadn't come easy since her husband passed. Abigail set the table with the good plates, the ones usually reserved for church gatherings, and when Daniel noticed, he raised an eyebrow at her. "Special occasion?" he asked. "Mother insisted," Abigail said, shooting a look toward the kitchen. "Apparently plain plates weren't good enough for the man who fixes our fences." "I heard that," Martha called from the stove, entirely unbothered. Dinner passed in easy conversation. Cattle prices, the coming harvest, a story about a bull that once chased the county preacher clean into the river. Abigail found herself laughing more than she had in months, and Daniel found himself in no hurry to leave, even after his plate was empty and the coffee had gone cold. When he finally rode home under a sky full of early stars, Martha stood on the porch beside her daughter and said nothing at all. She didn't need to. The smile on her face said everything. "Don't start," Abigail warned. "I haven't said a word," Martha replied, far too innocently. But she had already started, and she had no intention of stopping. The following week, Martha announced she needed supplies from town, flour, thread, and a new hinge for the pantry door, and declared, with a suddenness that fooled no one, that her knees were acting up something terrible and she couldn't manage the wagon alone. "Daniel's heading that way tomorrow," she said, not looking up from her mending. "I'm sure he wouldn't mind company on the road." Abigail narrowed her eyes. "Mother." "What? It's a long ride. Bandits, loose wheels. Who knows what could happen to a woman alone? You've made that trip alone 100 times. "Well," Martha said primly, "my knees weren't acting up then." The next morning, Abigail sat beside Daniel on the wagon bench, arms crossed, cheeks slightly pink from her mother's obvious meddling. Daniel, to his credit, kept his eyes on the road and said nothing about it, though the corner of his mouth kept twitching like he was fighting back a grin. "You know she's doing this on purpose," Abigail finally said. "I had a suspicion," Daniel replied.
"I'm sorry. She means well. She just doesn't know when to stop." "I don't mind," Daniel said quietly, and something about the honesty in his voice made Abigail glance over at him before she could stop herself. The ride to town, which should have taken an hour, seemed to pass in minutes. They talked about nothing important: her mother's garden, his father's failing eyesight, the new schoolhouse being built past the river, but by the time they reached the general store, something between them had shifted, quiet and unspoken, like the first warm day after a long winter.
It didn't take long for Miller's Creek to start talking. The town wasn't large, and little escaped its notice, especially not a young rancher helping a widow's daughter carry parcels from the general store, laughing together at something only they seemed to find funny. Mrs. Whitfield, who ran the sewing shop and considered herself the keeper of all town gossip, cornered Martha after church the following Sunday. "I hear young Daniel Cole's been spending an awful lot of time at your place," she said, eyebrows raised meaningfully.
"He's a good neighbor,"
Martha said simply, though her eyes glittered with something far less innocent. "A good neighbor who happens to be unmarried. And your Abigail happens to be unmarried too. Funny how that works out." "Isn't it just?" Martha said, and walked on without another word, leaving Mrs. Whitfield to draw her own conclusions, which, of course, were entirely correct. Abigail heard the whispers too, secondhand through friends at church, and it embarrassed her more than she wanted to admit. Not because the idea of Daniel was unpleasant, quite the opposite, if she were honest with herself, but because she hated the thought of being some project her mother had engineered, rather than something that had happened on its own. She decided then to pull back, just a little, just enough to prove to the town, to her mother, and mostly to herself, that whatever was growing between her and Daniel was real, and not simply the result of a widow's matchmaking. But what Abigail didn't know, what she couldn't have known, standing there stiff and proud in the church doorway, was that Daniel had already made up his mind about something. A decision was forming in him, quiet and stubborn as the man himself, one that had nothing to do with Martha's dinners or her convenient errands. And when it finally came due, it would arrive in the middle of a Wyoming storm, with far more at stake than either of them expected.
For 2 weeks, Abigail found reasons to be busy whenever Daniel came by. She stayed in the garden when he fixed the porch step, her back turned so she wouldn't have to watch him work with that easy, unhurried strength of his. She rode to her aunt's house the day he brought over a new milk cow as a gift from his father and spent the whole ride telling herself she wasn't disappointed to have missed him. She answered his greetings politely, briefly, and nothing more, though more than once she caught herself lingering at the window a beat too long after his wagon had gone. Daniel noticed, of course. He wasn't a fool. The silence between them had a weight to it now, thick as the summer heat that pressed down over the ranch, broken only by the low complaint of cattle in the distance and the dry rustle of wind through the wheat. And though it stung more than he expected, he didn't push. He simply kept coming around, kept helping where help was needed, and waited, patient as a man who'd spent his whole life working land that didn't yield easily, and had learned that good things took time.
Martha noticed too, and unlike her daughter, she wasn't quiet about it. "You're being stubborn," she told Abigail one evening as they shelled peas on the porch. "I'm not being anything. I just don't want people thinking I need you to arrange my life for me." "Nobody thinks that," Martha said. "They think a good man is sweet on you, and you're too proud to admit you're sweet on him back." Abigail said nothing, because there was nothing honest she could say that wouldn't prove her mother right.
That night, unable to sleep, she sat on the porch alone and watched the distant light of the Cole Ranch flicker across the dark fields. Far off toward the mountains, heat lightning flashed without sound, the sky flickering pale gold and then dark again, over and over like something restless was building out there and hadn't yet decided to come down. She missed him, simple as that. And somewhere past the ridge, that restlessness in the sky was about to decide for both of them.
The change came, as it often does out on the plains, through trouble rather than words. Wyoming summers could turn without warning, clear skies curdling into green-black clouds inside of an hour, the air going still and heavy just before the wind hit. That was exactly how it happened the day the storm rolled in. Fast, mean, and with almost no warning at all. The temperature dropping so sharp that Abigail felt it in her teeth before she ever heard the first crack of thunder. Her mother had gone to town that morning and wouldn't be back before dark. Abigail was alone when the sky broke open, and alone when she heard it. The splintering crack of wood giving way at the west fence, the very stretch Daniel had warned about weeks before. The soft cedar posts, weakened all spring by the wet ground, finally gave out entirely under the pressure of 6 panicked cattle throwing themselves against the rails. She ran for the pasture in the driving rain, but it was already too late to hold them by herself. The cattle scattered wild toward the ravine at the edge of the property, where the ground dropped away sharp and sudden, hidden now behind curtains of rain. She didn't have to wonder long who would come. Daniel had seen the herd break from his own land, and he rode straight into the storm without a second thought, his horse fighting the wind the whole way. By the time he reached her, the rain had turned the ground to churned mud, and 2 of the cattle were already dangerously close to the ravine's edge. "Get behind them! Drive them toward the barn!" Daniel shouted over the thunder, swinging down off his horse and grabbing for a length of loose rail from the broken fence. For one terrible moment, as he wedged himself between the panicked cattle and the drop of the ravine, the ground gave a little beneath his boots, wet and crumbling at the very edge, and Abigail's heart seized in her chest at the sight of him standing there, inches from the fall, refusing to move until the last of the herd had turned back toward safety. "Daniel!" she screamed, the word tearing out of her before she even knew she meant to say it. He didn't fall. He held his ground, hauled the rail up like a barrier, and between the 2 of them, soaked to the bone, half blind in the rain, shouting instructions no one could quite hear, They managed to turn the herd back from the ravine's edge and push them safely into the barn, just as the worst of the storm broke overhead. Only once the barn doors were shut against the wind did Abigail let herself shake. They stood there afterward, both drenched and breathless, lantern light flickering gold across the hay-scattered floor. And for the first time in weeks, the careful distance Abigail had built between them simply wasn't there anymore. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice unsteady. "That ground was giving way right under you." "I know," Daniel said simply. "Didn't much matter to me at the time." "Why not?" "Because you were standing right behind me, Abigail, and there wasn't a version of that moment where I let those cattle take you over that edge with them." The rain kept falling outside the barn doors, softer now, and neither of them moved to leave. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to come." "Yes, I did," Daniel said. And the way he said it, plain, certain, without hesitation, undid something in her that pride alone had been holding together. "I'm sorry," she said, "for pulling away. I just didn't want—" "I know why," Daniel said gently. "I understand it. I do. But I wasn't coming around because your mother asked me to. I kept coming because I wanted to see you. And today, when that ground started going out from under me, the only thing I could think of was getting back to you in one piece." "I've liked you since before the fence broke the first time," he admitted, a small, embarrassed laugh escaping him despite everything. "Truth is, I might have let that fence stay broken longer than I needed to, just for an excuse to come by." Abigail laughed despite herself, the tension of the last hour finally breaking loose. "That's terrible carpentry ethics." "Terrible," he agreed. "But it worked. My mother orchestrated half of this, you know," she said. "The dinners, the trip to town, all of it." "I know," Daniel said. "I let her, mostly. Didn't need much convincing." Abigail shook her head, smiling now in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in weeks. "So we've both been fools, dancing around something my mother figured out before either of us did. And it took a storm nearly taking you off a ravine to knock the sense back into me." "Seems that way," Daniel said, stepping a little closer. "Would you like to stop being fools then? Together, I mean." Abigail looked up at him, rain-soaked, sincere, hat forgotten somewhere in the mud outside, and felt the last of her pride give way to something far simpler and far braver. "I'd like that very much," she said. Outside, the storm had passed entirely, leaving behind a sky washed clean and streaked gold with the last of the evening sun. When Martha returned from town that evening, her wagon slowed by washed-out mud on the road, and found her daughter and Daniel sitting together on the porch steps, hands close but not quite touching. She said nothing. Later, once Daniel had ridden home, and Abigail sat brushing out her damp hair by the fire, Martha finally spoke. "So," she said, not looking up from her sewing. "Anything you'd like to tell me?" "You already know, Mother. I'd like to hear you say it anyway." Abigail sighed, though there was no real irritation left in her. "Daniel and we've decided to stop pretending there was nothing between us. It took him nearly getting swept off the ravine in that storm to make me admit it." Martha set down her needle, and for the first time in 2 years, Abigail saw tears gather in her mother's eyes that weren't born of grief. "Your father would have liked him," Martha said softly. "He always said a good man shows himself through his hands and his patience. Daniel has both, and today, it seems, he showed you his courage, too. You planned this from the very first day, didn't you?" "I had a feeling," Martha admitted, entirely unashamed. "A mother knows these things. I just gave the feeling a little encouragement." Abigail, and hugged her mother tightly. Finally, for every dinner invitation, every convenient errand, Every gentle push that had led her, however roundabout, exactly where her heart had wanted to go all along. What followed were the sweetest months Miller's Creek had seen in some time. Daniel came calling properly now, with his father's blessing, and no pretense of broken fences or borrowed tools. He and Abigail took long rides along the river at sunset, sat together at church without a single whisper of scandal. Together, he and old Thomas's hired hand rebuilt the west fence properly that autumn. Fresh cedar posts sunk deep past the frost line this time, well seasoned and treated against the wet spring ground that had caused all the trouble in the first place. Folks who rode past said it was the finest stretch of fence in the county, though Daniel always just smiled and said a fence built right only needed doing once. Martha, for her part, finally allowed herself to enjoy the simple pleasure of watching her daughter fall in love. One golden evening in early autumn, with the wheat fields turning amber behind them, Daniel took Abigail's hand as they stood at the very fence post where it had all begun. "I've fixed this fence more times than any fence in Wyoming is rightly needed fixing," he said. "And I think we both know why." Abigail smiled. "I think we do." "I don't want an excuse to come around anymore, Abigail. I want a reason to stay. For good, if you'll have me." From her spot on the porch, Martha pressed a hand to her chest. Abigail didn't answer right away, not because she was unsure, but because she wanted to remember the moment exactly as it was. The gold light on the wheat, the warmth of Daniel's hand around hers, the quiet, steady look in his eyes that had never once wavered, not from the first evening he'd stood on her porch with dust on his boots, not even when the ground had nearly given way beneath him in the storm. "Yes," she finally said. "I'll have you, Daniel Cole. For good." He kissed her then, gentle and certain, right there at the fence line that had brought them together in the first place. And somewhere behind them, Martha let out a small, triumphant laugh that carried clear across the yard. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the Coleman Ranch, under the same sky that had once sent a storm to push two stubborn hearts together. Martha stood at the front pew, dressed in her Sunday best, crying the kind of happy tears a mother waits years to shed. Daniel moved his things into the house not long after, and together he and Abigail took over the running of the ranch, while Martha, finally at peace, spent her days tending her garden and bragging to anyone who would listen that she'd known from the very first evening exactly how the story would end. "A mother always knows," she liked to say. "Sometimes love just needs a little push, and every now and again a good, hard storm to find its way home." And there, friends, is where we'll leave the Coleman Ranch, with a widow at peace, a daughter in love, and a young rancher who finally has more reason to stay than any fence could ever give him. I think what I love most about this story isn't the romance itself, though it's sweet enough on its own. It's the quiet patience of it all. Nobody rushed. Nobody forced anything that wasn't already there. Martha didn't create love between Daniel and Abigail. She simply gave two people who already belonged together enough gentle chances. And sometimes, like that storm rolling in off the mountains, life gives us a harder push than we ever asked for. Not to hurt us, but to finally knock the pride loose from something our hearts had already decided long before. If there's a lesson in this one, I think it's this. Don't be too proud to accept the quiet pushes life gives you toward the people who are good for you. Sometimes, the people who love us see our own hearts more clearly than we do. And sometimes, it takes a little thunder to make us listen. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, wherever you're listening from. If this story warmed your
Já
evening
pegamos
even
tudo o
a
que
little,
precisávamos.
I'd love for
Ótimo.
you to stick
Agora
around.
podemos voltar
There
para
are
o
more
rancho.
tales like this one waiting, and more evenings to spend together under quiet skies and old wooden porches. Until next time, friends, take care of each other, and I'll see you in the next story.